I have worked on many investigations now for more than 15 years, 20 years, using computer-assisted or data journalism to find stories. This has been for both TV as well as at the New York Times and other publications. The stories that I've worked on have used data to do things like find how unregulated and tainted chemical ingredients coming from China have been entering the world's pharmaceutical supply chain, so that if you were to go and buy drugs at your local pharmacy, that sometimes these contain tainted, unregulated chemicals that have had sometimes very tragic effects, leading to injuries and even people dying. I've worked on a story like that. I've worked on other stories, for instance, that have examined how one of the largest railroads in the United States had workers that were falsely claiming that they were disabled and taking advantage of millions of dollars in pension payments. I've worked on stories that have mined the WikiLeaks cable troves. I've looked at how city police departments across the United States have engaged in particular patterns of racial profiling, targeting people even to the point where it meant that people with something as innocuous as traffic tickets were later being gunned down by police in chases. I've looked at how in the U.S., one of the largest insurance companies is State Farm, and how that they were systematically defrauding their own policyholders when they were injured in auto accidents. All of these stories used computer-assisted reporting. The ones I just described to you, almost all of them involved a lot of complex analysis. But they all were stories that could not have been done if not for computer-assisted reporting or data journalism. Ah, sure, failures. Okay. Give me a moment. We certainly have those, although I try very early that if a story doesn't seem like it's going anywhere, to stop the pain sooner rather than later. There's several ways that I might be working on a story. In some cases, I see an interesting data set or think that something might be possible, and I go and rummage through that data. In other occasions, we have a story idea that might be floating around the newsroom. Sometimes there's stories that are about to be killed. Editors come to me and say, we have this story, it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Do you think you might be able to work on it? And then in a third scenario that's also common is that I'll just be talking with a reporter that I get along with particularly well, and we'll start kicking around ideas and see what might work. And then to go back to your idea about failures, I mean, I know that there are times where I enter a story and I think that it might prove to be very fruitful. And there are times where I'm just underwhelmed by the results, and you just try to decide whether to kill the story, or maybe just write something far shorter, or go back and just say, well, listen, there's a story in the sense that we know of anecdotal cases from lawsuits or other reporting means, but the data is not going to really help us here. I use a variety of tools to do my work. I use a spreadsheet program and a database program a lot of the time. Now, for spreadsheets, yeah, I use Excel. I'll also use Google Spreadsheets. I've used other spreadsheet programs in the past, but these days, mostly Excel for my spreadsheets. I still do some stuff with Google Spreadsheets. For database managers, I use a variety of database managers. SQL Server, MySQL, I'll use Even Access or FoxPro. I don't really have religion about my database programs. I also use mapping programs and statistical programs as well regularly. But for mapping, I do most of my mapping in ArcMap. I do most of my statistical work in SPSS, although I do some in R as well. But you know, these programs all change, so I hope whoever your readers or viewers are, what they realize is don't get wedded to the program so much as to the tool. Oh, I need a database manager. Oh, I'll use this one. I happen to know it, or it's easy to use. Google Spreadsheets is great for sharing with other reporters. So if I work with other reporters who are good at using spreadsheets as well, a Google spreadsheet is a good thing to do. The other thing too is that Google's spreadsheets have some functionality that Excel spreadsheets don't have. So for instance, you can more easily parse web pages online using a Google spreadsheet. On the other hand, Excel has some features that Google Spreadsheet doesn't have. So for instance, there's a relatively new add-on to Excel spreadsheets called Node Excel, which is just wonderful for doing social networking analysis off a Google spreadsheet. I mean, off of an Excel spreadsheet. So sometimes which spreadsheet I'll use can depend on where it is I might be headed. For finding data sets online, I can outline several ways to do it. One way to think about it is, particularly for if you have older journalists watching this, they might be saying, well, look, I'm familiar with going to a courthouse and asking for a document. Or you may say, look, I know that in the Netherlands, I have to fill out a form when I want to vote in an election. So knowing that these forms are filled out should tell you that data exists somewhere, that all these kinds of documents, whether it's in a courthouse or a voting record or a driving record, these exist somewhere in a database. So then the question is, where will this database be? If I know that I'm interested in certain kinds of records, where might it be? If I'm interested in shipping going in and out of the Netherlands, okay, I know that every time a ship leaves, someone has to fill out a form somewhere documenting the ship, documenting at least some part of its contents. So how do I get the data? Now, you may look online, and in some cases, like imports and exports from the Netherlands, in the United States, I can look up and maybe not know the ship, but I can know the kinds of goods that are documented to be coming from the Netherlands into the United States. And I can even rank it and figure out, what does the Netherlands ship to the United States more than than other nations, and what does it ship to us less than other nations? So having a sense that documents are kept can tell you what websites to begin to search. Now, you can do simple things like using Google and some of the Google advanced searches to find a data set. And you may say to yourself, well, I'll do a search for Google and I'll ask for CSV files, because I know that a CSV file is kind of a data file. So I'll say, does it have a CSV file, and is it on this website? What CSV files appear on this particular government's website? Oh, look, there are these CSV files that I can download. That may be great. But other times you may say to yourself, well, look, I know that they keep the records, and look, when I go to this government website or this business's website, they have summary data, you know, kind of like, you know, the number of shipments that were sent last year was 3,279,000. Well, look, if they have the summary data, then they must have the individual data. So sometimes you use the web to find the database. Sometimes you'll use the web to find the right people to call to ask for the database. And then the third scenario is that you're going to use the database, even though the government or a business may not give you the database, but you realize that on the web pages themselves is your data. So you can use some web scraping tools, scrape the website, and take those results and put them into a database. So that's the third way, web scraping, that you can create a data set out of web pages to analyze. If a reporter then also has web scraping skills, that's great. Sometimes the knowledge you have is, you know, enough knowledge to say, I need to find somebody who can help me scrape a site. And other times you may actually have the knowledge yourself how to scrape. I think it's more and more, as journalists, we're all required to have a broad set of skills. So Web scraping is a great skill to have. If you don't have it, at least recognizing you don't have it and may need to find somebody who knows how to do it on certain stories, that too is a great skill. You know, the worst is if you're a reporter and you don't realize that web scraping will help you with a story, but you don't even realize that you need to find someone to help you to do it, to do the story. That to me would be the worst case. There have been several attempts at, from companies that try to make utilities and programs that make web scraping easier. So I think this is one of those things we're talking now. Scraping requires some programming skill. But if you were to tell me in 5 or 10 years that you don't need programming skills, that you don't need programming skills to scrape, I would not be surprised. I mean, it just seems to be something that we're headed more and more in that area, you know, with so many other programs. So maybe, you know, right now programming skills are good, whether it's in Python or Ruby, or maybe you're going to, you know, do some simple scraping using Google spreadsheets because it has some power to scrape. Maybe you work for a company that has a lot of money, so you're buying a program like Kapow that does scraping with less programming knowledge. So there are various routes you might take. We actually will do data visualizations early in the reporting process. If I were to map my data, or if I were to do a social network, or if I were to do a series of charts, and those things tell me something, you know, all of a sudden something jumps out, that information is valuable, and I'll start actually using it to report out on the story. So for instance, when I was at NBC in television, we were looking at the phenomena of how one car manufacturer had an abnormal number of cases of sudden acceleration. You know, that became clear by doing charts, and we saw that very early on. I was describing a racial profiling story that I did, I did the charts and maps for that in the first 2 weeks of the story. Those became crucial in part to convince everybody that these were stories we should be doing. So for instance, I was looking at, with the case of racial profiling, we were interested in a very particular kind of racial profiling, a kind that had not yet been reported about here in the United States. And that had to do with police stopping and ticketing African Americans in particular for what's known as non-moving violations. Not wearing a seatbelt, not having a driver's license in your wallet. The thing is about these tickets is they're very hard to spot without stopping somebody, and they are also what police call high discretionary tickets. If you go 1,000 miles an hour or 1,000 kilometers an hour in front of a police car, they're going to stop you. That's a low discretionary stop. A policeman sees you speeding at a very high rate, they're probably not going to think twice. But to see you without a seatbelt and to think about stopping you and giving you a ticket, that's a different kind of police ticket. And when I ran through the data, what I saw was that blacks and whites get speeding tickets and stop sign tickets at about the same rate in Cincinnati. But when it came time to these non-moving violations, those are tickets that go almost always to blacks. And that became a very important story because in Cincinnati, there was a young black male who was a very hardworking person, not involved in the drug trade, who was stopped repeatedly for apparently no reason whatsoever. And the police, to justify their stops, were giving him non-moving tickets. He was later shot and killed because of those non-moving violations. And so we started analyzing police precincts across the country, and we could see how police in other cities as well were engaging in this kind of profiling. Visualization was crucial, both maps and charts. Visualizations were crucial to me spotting that story and asking questions. Now, later on, for the production of that documentary, yes, we had wonderful graphics that appeared. Those were not done by me. I'm horrible on the production side of graphics. I can suggest things to graphics. I can say, look, when we're analyzing, say, how soldiers are dying in Afghanistan or Iraq, these are graphics that might be helpful to tell, but they're much better at presenting the information. Well, Excel is great for some charts to do them quickly. A statistical program called R is really good for what's known as spark lines, which are a great way to see if there's something unusual. You have a lot of data. Let's say I have data of every single university in the United States, and I have data over time about every university of the United States. And let's say the data I had was how much money they charge each student and how much they charge them 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and today, or some other long period of time. Well, something as simple as spark lines is a great way to see which universities are different than other universities. Spark lines are a great tool for what they call small multiples of data. R is a great program for doing that, but Excel, they just added a package so that you can do spark lines easily. So, I'll use whatever I can to do spark lines if it's R or Excel. I talked about social networking. And for mapping, I do most of my mapping in ArcMap. But again, I think what's important for anybody is to realize is, look, you can do mapping. Maybe you'll use Google Fusion tables to do mapping. And if that gives you the map to tell you the information you need to know, that's great. So there are free tools out there. I find ArcMap is just a great tool for doing high-end mapping. We're fortunate here in the United States. We have many conferences where you can go and learn the latest tools. And one thing that's exciting from my visit to the Netherlands is to see, with people like Hank and Luke, that you all more and more in the Netherlands are not only using these tools for stories, but also teaching other journalists how to use these tools. And that's terribly exciting to see these tools spread across international boundaries. So going to training is a great way to keep up. And, I still go to training seminars because, there's so much to learn out there. It's exciting and challenging, but it keeps things interesting. One visualization I was very proud of was I'm involved in our coverage of tracking and seeing how our soldiers have been dying in Afghanistan and Iraq. We have a database that we built in-house to track the deaths of soldiers. It involves some web scraping, some data input, and it also involves getting the data by FOIA. By analyzing the data, one of the fields of data that we pull out is whether you've died under hostile conditions or non-hostile conditions. Another thing we pull out is whether you died because of an IED, those plastic explosives that are buried into the ground. And by doing data visualizations, we were able to figure out exactly when the tipping points happened in the war without waiting, in both wars, Afghanistan and Iraq. We did not have to wait for the Pentagon or some other people to say that this was a problem. We actually were seeing it in the data, and we could then write those clear, definitive sentences that say, for the first time this past month, the majority of US soldiers who died in combat died from IEDs. That's something that data allowed us to do. A second example of a visualization is we've been having a map on our website that allows you to track homicides in New York City, murders in the city. And this is great in a lot of ways because the user can play with it. So if you're interested in murders in Brooklyn, you can use the data and say, I want to find all the murders in Brooklyn for 10 years. Oh, no, wait, I'm just interested in murders in this neighborhood in Brooklyn for the last 5 years. Oh, no, wait, I'm interested in murders in Brooklyn that involve just African Americans for the last 2 years. Well, this data visualization allows viewers to play with it however they wish. We've used it to do stories, and we've used it as well to give viewers and readers a chance to play with the data and do things they couldn't, to play with it all the different ways that they want to. A third example of a visualization is the Olympics. We have the Olympics coming up in London. And I was interested several years ago. In 2004, I remember hearing that there was a gentleman skiing for Spain, and his name was Johann Mueller. And I was really interested how a guy named Johann Mueller ends up skiing for Spain. The long story short is that he's an example of a world-class athlete, a person who becomes a top-flight athlete at another nation. Johann first skied cross-country for Germany. Who then decides to flip countries. And I always thought that when you ski at the Olympics, you ski for your native land. Well, it turns out there are all these athletes who don't compete for their native land. They actually hop countries. In some cases, they do it just for the money. I got a data set of all the athletes who have ever competed for the United States. I culled through the data set. I figured out which athletes were country hopping world-class athletes. It turns out there were several dozen of them that came to the United States for no reason except to compete for the United States. Some even said they did it for the money. And then we did a data visualization to show how this mattered. We showed how without getting athletes from other nations in the Torino Olympics, the United States would not have finished in sole possession of second place. That we were able to show how more and more these athletes were coming to the United States, more and more they were medaling for the United States, and they were medaling to such a degree that by 2006 they were actually altering the outcomes of the Olympic Games. In many of the things that I'm working on, I hope it's clear to everybody that these all involve to some degree or another group projects. And in the case of the homicides application, okay, that was my idea. It was my idea in large part because we were doing a similar data approach to war casualties. And I was saying, look, we seem to have developed the systems to do war casualties very well. How can we apply this knowledge to other stories that we're not yet doing? And no one in New York City was doing homicides, in large part because the police department make it very difficult to do these kinds of maps. Okay, great. Well, we've developed, the technical know-how. How do we bring this to the web? Well, this will involve talking with some brilliant people in our graphics department, some brilliant people in our news interactive department, and some people who also are very skilled at doing data visualizations that have a lot of user functionality. So these involved some bright people like Matt Block in our graphics department, who's great at making flash interactives. It involved others of us saying, well, we want the interactive to work this way, but not this other way. Maybe for data integrity reasons, or maybe because the data is not that interesting. Or maybe the data is terribly interesting. We want to make sure we have this other kind of functionality. So it's a group process, but it involves some very bright people. The visualizations we're just talking about are not something that can be snapped together in an afternoon. They can require weeks or months of thought, programming, analysis. Part of it is journalistic, where you're saying how good is the data? Is it reliable? What stories can we tell with the data, even interactive stories? And then it also involves thought about presenting the data cleanly. I've seen some visualizations where it seems like the news organization was saying, we got this data set, we're going to throw it onto the web. And they use some simpler out-of-the-box tools that allow them to quickly create a whole series of web pages, but they don't allow the reader to really see the story. So, for instance, I think I've seen examples of databases of car accidents. And what they're just thrown onto the web, but they don't really allow you to see, which roads have the most accidents, or which roads, have the most of a particular kind of accident. Maybe drunk driving accidents late at night. You might be interested in just the subset of the data. Does it happen mostly in the downtown area? Where do certain kinds of accidents happen? And instead, all they're doing is throwing out, like, look, click on the accidents in your town. And you click on it, and the next thing you know, you end up with a list of accidents. And maybe you can sort it by time, but you can't see, the patterns. Those are the kinds of things that I have, that I kind of wonder why we even bother to do it. It's nice to throw data out there, but if it doesn't allow readers to really see things, I'm not sure it's worth the effort. As journalists, what we are first and foremost are storytellers, and we're trying to, analyze data in part to get at stories that we would otherwise miss. So whether it's finding the great anecdotes, or whether it's also finding the big picture, that if we didn't use data, we would not be able to see the big picture. I mean, this is why, many of the reasons why we use data journalism. Find stories that we would otherwise miss, find telling anecdotes, or find the big patterns. And it's important to realize that this is a tool, and you want to use the tool when it's the right time to use the tool. Sometimes, there are stories that don't really require a lot of data analysis. That's okay. There are many great stories told without data. But when you do use data, and to realize that there are these opportunities to then, carefully evaluate, how can I best apply my resources? And this involves the kind of creative thinking that we all do as journalists. What do we think that would be interesting? What's really curious? What strikes us? The same type of tenacity, the same type of curiosity, you're bringing that to data. And you want to be thorough as well, and really, really dogged in how you check things out. This is the large themes that run through data analysis, or using data to do journalism. So you never want to lose sight of those things. Sometimes when you're doing a lot with data, you can be so focused on what's going on technically that you can lose sight of these journalistic concerns. But I think this is what we bring to the table as journalists, that we're going to find stuff in data that people might miss, or find the great anecdote, or find the big picture. So be thorough, ask a lot of questions, but try to find these things that we couldn't tell otherwise, because as journalists, what do we bring to the table to society as at large? One of the things we bring is this capacity to find stories you didn't know about. And data journalism is one more tool to say, look, if you're wondering what separates a journalist from people who could be tweeting the latest news, one of the things is, look, we can step back and find these stories that, if journalists didn't do them, would go untold.